Okay, perhaps we should not wait any longer and going ahead with the third lecture of the spring series of Speaking from the Margins, the online lecture series of the Database of Byzantine Book Epigrams project. As you know, we are already for the third season organizing online lectures approximately every month. Seeing in the beginning, of course, this was inspired by the pandemic situation, but we have seen that this is quite a success. And with this, we are also able to invite people from all the corners of the world. And also today we have to take this quite literally because we have invited Luise Marion Frenkel from Brazil. Professor Frenkel is assistant professor of classical Greek at the University of São Paulo in Brazil, but she has spent quite some time in Europe as well at various research and educational institutions. She's interested in many aspects of late antique culture, literature, and let's say transmission of knowledge. Perhaps here I want to single out that she has also worked on the reception of ancient philosophy and ancient thinking in general in the Middle Ages, not only in the Greek tradition, but also in traditions and other languages. So, which gives her work a very, let's say, broad perspective, in which she has also been dealing with paratexts, and this, of course, is a nice. Let's say a hook towards our perspective. Just before I give the floor to Professor Frenkel, I wanted to share some practical tips and advice. So you can, of course, ask questions, and you're invited to do so after the lecture. So then we will also open the chat function in this Zoom lecture. Also, as always, we appreciate that you leave on your camera, so the speaker has someone to look at and not the impression of just staring at the screen. But you're completely free to do so or not. Without further ado, I think we can now move on to the talk of Professor Frenkel itself. Luise Marion Frenkel, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I will start sharing my screen. I hope this worked. And I also would like to thank for all the encouragement and help support over the last couple of months, exchanging ideas about book epigrams which were or were not already in DBBE, and also adding a few with a lot of information which has been quite interesting. This presentation has three parts. I will first explain my goals in looking at Byzantine book epigrams. Then I will present some very tentative conclusions which can be drawn from the repertory of patristic book epigrams in DBBE, before finally turning to a number of pseudo-new findings and some user-related reflections about the challenges which lie ahead for the project and users alike. From the start, I need to clarify that I am not a Byzantinist and that my knowledge of Byzantine poetry has huge gaps. Secondly, my involvement with DBBE is sporadic and so far not directly related to my other research and teaching activities. Feel free to call me a DBBE amateur. Still, I met and meet the criteria of the 2019 call for papers addressed to anyone interested in this particular genre of Byzantine poetry. As soon as I found out about the version launched in June 2019, I was curious to see if for late antique authors, it can be also said that canonical authors have been a favorite subject for poets throughout the history of Greek literature. I was disappointed, but not surprised to see that the status of patristic authors is not mirrored in the book epigrams which can be related to them. Indeed, my previous experience, albeit limited, of margins of patristic manuscripts was that of a deadly silence in all that vast expanse, not a single ripple stirs. Over the last 10 years, I have been looking at manuscripts of conciliar documentation, such as the Collectio Vaticana, also better known as Vatican Library Greek manuscript 830. Unsurprisingly, one of the not digitized codices of the Vatican Library, of the conciliar acts of the Council of Ephesus, or also, and here you see the Munich manuscript 331, which has Theodotus of Cyrus' exposition of the Nicene Creed. Nowhere are scholia, annotations, and other paratexts to be seen, as can still be found in some older manuscripts, such as the Latin Paris manuscripts 8907, which has in the margins of Ambrose's report of the Acts of Aquileia, the famous Arian scholar. However, it is important to flip back in this manuscript and remember that all other pages are a deadly silent expanse, and bear in mind that manuscripts such as the Collectio Vaticana, the one 830, contains some older marginalia and gaps which point to a cleaning up of paratexts of the original. Therefore, I had not put much hope in finding verses in the margins of collections of conciliar documents, collections of canons, apologetic treatises, and other works laying out the orthodoxy, since the vast majority of book epigrams are found in Middle or Late Byzantine manuscripts, which would already have cleaned up late antique stuff. Still, I was surprised with what I found. In 2019, the BBE listed 17, I know the numbers are here slightly different, but the BBE listed 17 manuscripts with works by Theodoret of Cyrus, which have book epigrams, including a number of text-related poems with a dozen verses or more, but only 3 book epigrams for Athanasius, of which only 2 were text-related, and for that matter, very formulaic. And among the 11 manuscripts containing works by Cyril of Alexandria with book epigrams, most were about the scribe or patron. Now, Theodoret of Cyrus' reputation has a bumpy record, to say the least. His writings against Cyril were anathematized at the Second Council of Constantinople during the 3-chapter controversy in Justinian's reign, and over the next centuries, some regarded him as a heretic. Others continued to admire some of his works. It is thus not surprising that among the book epigrams about him, which now, as of 18th April this year, add up to 15 occurrences, those author-related epigrams which go beyond the basics illustrate his wisdom, poetically giving guarantees to the works. In the meantime, the corpus of Theodoret-related book epigrams is large and complex enough to merit a lecture on their own. Suffice it to say that we have, this is the overview of what we have. So we have here 3 verses at the end of the questions on the Octateuch in the 11th century Vatican Valliceriana B25. We also have 13 verses at the end of the Eranistes in the 12th century Vatican 624 manuscript, which were copied along much of the marginalia into 2 later manuscripts. Ettlinger, in his 1975 edition of the book Epigram, mentions it as a poem which has no link with Theodoret and is printed at the end of the text for historical interest. Noticing, moreover, that all editions prior to his own had ultimately depended on this Vatican 624 manuscript only, and had therefore been aware of the poem. Ettlinger himself pays more attention to a few older manuscripts, okay? In his 2003 translation for the Church Fathers series, he makes no mention of the poem and offers no translation. Babbage, in his 2005 Croatian translation, adds the poem just after the main work, and as if it was by Theodoret, in spite of the use of some ornaments. Perhaps he mentions in the introduction or the notes that it's not by Theodoret, but sorry, I can't read Croatian. What we also have for Theodoret is this standalone 15 verses book epigram at the end of A Cure of the Greek Melodies in this Urbinati Graeci 117, which also gains prime space as added leaf recto of the first folio of the 15th century Florence manuscript 11.3, which is a manuscript which has Theodoret's interpretation of Ezekiel, Daniel, and then finally also the Cure of Greek Melodies. Now, because I'm mentioning the works, is that if we turn now, and just to see where we are in the list, if we turn now to this to this manuscript, we have this book epigram, which was copied onto the version of the folio added to the 17th century British Library manuscript, which reminds us that so far we have not really discussed the reception of Byzantine book epigrams in this lecture series. And last but not least, we have, sorry, this border too, last but not least, we have in the margins of this image of John Chrysostom is the main figure, flanked by Oikoumenius and Theodoret of Cyrus. We have this book epigram here in the margins, which comes also up in clusters of book epigrams, both in the ahead of a commentary of Oikoumenius on the epistles, and also here what you see is the Parisian manuscript, which has not only this one as the third one. Third one is this one in the yellow box, and this manuscript has 22 book epigrams. So you see that book epigram being reused in clusters of book epigrams. But as I said, Theodoret is a topic for another lecture. I'm just using Theodoret to show one guy for whom we have a lot, because for the others, we do not really have much. What about Theodoret's friend? I mean inverted commas like Nestorius, or his enemies like Cyril? What about Athanasius and Eusebius? What about other church historians, such as not only Eusebius, but also Socrates? Try searching types for Cyril of Diduceia, better known as Cyril of Alexandria, and you will find 3 book epigrams, including spurious poems of Psellos on Cyril's commentaries of Amos and Micah, which say more about the prophet than the church father. So we really do not have anything for Cyril. On the other hand of the row, we find for Nestorius one single book epigram in the BB, which merits some attention. The transcription hints at what is going on here. This is not about Nestorius, but actually about Origen. And indeed, it appears in the margins of Origen's Philokalia. I really wish I could have seen an image of this book epigram to be able to say something more about it. After all, this book epigrams fits into a long history of metatexts warning readers about the dangers ahead, some of which are rough and graffitied stamps of disapproval, while others go to lengths to caricature the heretic or address him. For example, in the 7th century Tura papyri, one has in the lower margin, which I put the highlight to the left, after the title to Book 5, a note from the scribe stating that he always marvels at Origen as being eminent, but never reads him as orthodox. In the same vein, we find the 13th century 4 verses long book epigram in the Vatican manuscript 401, while the late 14th century massive and very sonorous 22 verses long poem at the end of the Philokalia fits somewhere between this approach and what we had seen for Theodore. Needless to say, these two Vatican Library manuscripts are not available online, and De Vres's catalogue is really not helpful to understand how such paratexts were intended to work. So far, the DBB lists only one more book epigram for Origen, a single 15th century verse which adds little to the picture. To sum up this second part, the incidental remark suggests that book epigrams do not seem to reflect patristic authority, quite on the contrary. It almost seems that the more infamous a church father was, the more likely it was that book epigrams would be written about him. Any attempt to pursue this hypothesis relies on an argument of silence about book epigrams related to the authors on which the orthodoxy of the post-iconoclasm Byzantine Empire relied more heavily, or their work, or the manuscripts with their works. Is DBB reliable enough to allow such conclusions? I wish I could say yes, but having noticed some patterns in the editions of patristic works and in the transmission of the manuscripts, I am doubtful. The problem is not with DBB, it lies before. In the final part, I turn to some rather well-known but undervalued book epigrams which have been only recently added to DBB. First, the 15th century book epigrams in the 10th century Florence manuscript 77 of Eusebius and Socrates church histories, partially published in 1870 in the third volume of Cugn's extended version of the Palatine Anthology, adding other epigrams which he managed to find both in books and in on marble. And then the massive poem of Athanasius by Doxapatris in the Basiliensis A34, which Mini published in the first volume of the Patrologia Graeca of Athanasius' works. In between, I will mention the 14th or 15th century verses at the end of the early 10th century Paris manuscript 451, which has Eusebius' Preparatio Evangelica and Contra Hieroclem as last works. Now, let's first look at 77. Okay. Since the publication of an article by Maria Luisa Agatti in 2001, this Florence manuscript 77 counts as one more of the copyists of Dionysius manuscripts. Lydia Peria had, since the late 1980s, identified a common hand in a handful of 10th century minuscule manuscripts, which include a wide range of works ranging from Xenophon's Cyropedia to Nicetas' refutation of the Quran, written only a few years before the manuscript was made. This scribe worked not only for the Dionysius mentioned in book epigrams in the Tetraevangelion, but also for Aretha of Caesarea, as in the case of the volume with conciliar documentation, the first one in this list. Now, the Florence manuscript 77 was annotated by several hands from the beginning, and the hands are hard to distinguish. It also has marginalia from its model, copied by the scribe himself. Some of this annotation may have been Aretha's, although we do not know if this was one of the manuscripts made for Aretha. However, tastes change, and so do also the relevant issues of the day. Thus, in the 15th century, a reader objected to the marginalia, venting his impression in derogatory verses. Are they good? Not really. Do they merit being printed under the heading of Epigrammata irrisoria, as in Cuny? We are doing ourselves a huge disfavor in continuing the tradition of judging the quality of poetry of other ages. Can we really say that the author of verses, and more importantly, who read them, shared our opinion? They may have been aware that they used the language and valued stylistic effects differently, but I cannot imagine that they suffered from a decline and fall complex. You can, of course, argue that the very point of the verses was to express a judgment about the marginalia. Yes, but it is a different approach from that which developed alongside the production of printed edition and the humanist commentary tradition. I've noticed that I've spoken already a lot, so I will summarize my final slides. I'm not going to enter into details about this manuscript. The point is that it's already known for a long time that we do have book epigrams at the end of the Eusebius church history, which are the books epigrams here. Now the point is the Eusebius church history ends here, and I mean part about Eusebius ends here and then continues with Socrates. So this is one thing. We actually have a cluster of book epigrams. The first one is just the remark that it is against the scholia, the previous scholia, but it is in verse. And these are the two poems which have been already printed in Cuny, okay? But what has gone unsaid more or less over the last centuries and decades is that we also have in 199 verso and 200 recto some book epigrams in the lower margin. Now the point, and this has been a huge work by the DBV, I really congratulate you, not least because I mean this is the part of 199. Thanks very much indeed. But also because for the one on the recto of 200, it's actually being cut by when it was bound again, and something has gone missing. Not so much of the scholia, but at least of the book epigram. About this one in the Parisinus Graecus, I just wanted to mention that I came across it when I was just going through the Suas Chrétienne edition of the Praeparatio Evangelica, which happened to be the only book with some text critical remarks on a weekend when almost all libraries around me were closed. And I was lucky enough to be in Cambridge. But even then it was all close, and I was then looking, they made in a footnote there was a remark that Mraz had missed the point that the whole line is actually metrical, that we actually have two verses written continuously, but the interesting thing is that this comes at the very end of the manuscript, but the information is picked out of, and that means it comes after the Contra Hieroclem. But as I was saying, it's mentioned in the edition of the Praeparatio Evangelica, which is considered a far more important work by Eusebius. And the editors go and look at it because of the point of who looked at the manuscript, and the fact that it mentions this monk Militis. Okay. I also like this Paris manuscript because, very much like the Florence manuscript, it dismisses any idea that patristic manuscripts have nothing in their margins. Quite the contrary. What we do have here is something interesting. It, as I mentioned, it is a 10th century manuscript. It's dated 914. It was made by Byzantine for Aretha, and Aretha added marginalia across the whole manuscript. But some later stuff was added. For example, some sermons by Theophylact of Bulgari, sorry. And this is something from the 11th, 12th century, okay? Now, I want to say something finally about the Doxapatris poem about, which is often mentioned, called In Arium to the praise of Athanasius, because as Opitz mentions when he adds, this is the Patrologia Graeca edition, okay? Because as Opitz, oops, sorry, and I don't know how, as Opitz mentions in his Urkunden volume, he adds a paraphrase. This is not a poem about Athanasius. This is just the beginning, and it goes on to be a dedicatory poem where this Doxapatris adds a lot of common features, I mean, topoi, about how he is facing enemies, pagans and heretics, about his struggles in the capital and things like that, which have been read historically by many, including Opitz. But recently, we have looked again at the text and said, wait, these are mostly literary features, but still, this is the Doxapatris poem. Now, there's something interesting. Although it's been printed by Mini, it's not yet in DBB. And the point is, it's not it's left, it's falling between the margins of our transition from older editions like Mini to our online editions, because there is no room in online editions for at least of church fathers for such stuff. If we take, for example, the very good Patristic text archive, which has been launched a couple of years ago and is offering multi-texts of patristic works, it has no field for marginalia. Mini printed Doxapatris poem. It's not going to be printed in the Athanasius Werke series of volumes. So I know that the people who are preparing editions of acts of council, such as Erik Lamberts and Annette von Stockhausen and all these people, they have seen the marginalia. They tell me there are no book epigrams in acts of councils. Okay, thanks. But might be because we just are not looking at all manuscripts, and a lot of things are falling. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. So that's why I called this lecture the Diaphanous Reputation. It's both because of that disbalance, that not really Cyril, there's nothing, no book epigram about Cyril as far as we can say. About Theodore, there's a lot. In a way, the more controversial the author, the more book epigrams are defending him, perhaps. And also the issue about how book epigrams have been regarded by modern editors almost as if they were an embarrassment for them, better left in footnotes and not edited, as they are in classical works. And DBB, by separating classical works from Christian works, is perpetuating a modern tradition which is not that of Balen, of Aretha's, of the users of the Byzantine manuscripts who added book epigrams just to a Xenophon as to Eusebius' church history. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your remarks, corrections, and comments. Thank you. Stop sharing.
Okay, thank you very much for this lecture with many interesting observations, and also with also we have to thank you for your engagement with DBBE. Which was very clear from your lecture. I'm sure there are reactions and questions. So you can ask your questions either directly by raising your hands, by raising your virtual hand, or just by turning on your camera and raising your real hand, or you can type a question in the chat function of the Zoom meeting. Julian?
Yes, thank you, Marion, Luise Marion. That was very interesting. I am very amazed at this 17.7 Florentian manuscript, and I want to know more about it. So, can you tell us more about what are the verses commenting on? As I understand, I went into DBB, I wasn't aware of these poems, and they are commenting on another scholiast. Is that correct? And then, just two precise question would be, do you have any idea who is this poet and who the scholiast is? And also, why do you think the poet copied, as I understand, the same poem in the middle of the work in the margins and then at the end? Do you have any idea why this would have happened? Thank you.
As far as I could see, all people looking at the works of the copyist of Dionysius, they are not. They have no information about who is written in the margins. Everyone says only that there are plenty of hands. In this case, there is the Aretha's hand cannot be identified, and we also have no idea who added the book Epigrams. Commenting on the scholiast. There is clearly a factor that some of the scholia are in Eusebius church history and others are in Socrates church history. So the warning about the quality of the scholia is added the same book epigram in both works. That's one thing. The other thing is considering the similarity. Of course, it could be a monk like Meletius. Which is in the other one. It's the same pattern. 9th, 10th century manuscripts full of scholia, which are then addressed in book epigrams in the 14th, 15th century. That's a very general remark. No, I'm sorry. As far as I can see, no one has any information on this.
Thank you. That's
and about the scholia, I can say many people looked at the manuscript between the late 10th, the 10th and the 11th century and added remarks of all possible sorts.
Thank you.
It is a fascinating phenomenon, which has only recently been picked up. This habit of fighting polemics in the margins of manuscripts, and then the scholiast, and then reacting against each other, arguing against each other, and frequently doing so in verse. It remains a fascinating phenomenon that should be perhaps researched a little bit from closer or in a more thorough manner. Because there is other evidence, the poems of Tzetzes that Julian knows well, poems of Constantine the Rhodian in the same vein. So it's very interesting. Any other questions?
If I may add something about the 77, in the excellent study about Eusebius church history by Morlaix-Perron, there is a chapter, now I can't remember the author, who looks at the transmission of the text, and among other things, he makes some remarks about 77, but he says nothing about the book Epigrams. He is really interested in the transmission of the main text and about the existence of different editions and things like that. So he shares actually Edward Schwartz and others' main concerns. It's just that he now, 21st century, values marginalia slightly differently from the early 20th century, but book epigrams are for them still not relevant. And I should not be telling you this, you know this. But it's somehow, I struggle to get the message across to them.
Me myself, I was of course triggered by this epigram of Mavropus that was being reused in defense of Theodoret of Syr, which is actually taken to be an epigram on an image of Theodoret. If you look at the Greek, it uses the verb graphi and grapho, which can be both, but it's difficult to imagine that it's really a book epigram originally by Mavropus. It has to be about a painting, so for which the same verb is also used. But then it's being reused in a book epigram to take the defense of Theodoret, who, as you say, has a very bumpy record in the Byzantine period, but who always has had his defenders, apparently. So I also find this like a nice example of how an epigram originally for a work of art can be reused also in a context of as a book epigram. And this also this of course ties in with your remark that it seems to me that's the, let's say, the controversial reputation of some of these patristic authors triggers book epigrams as if it was also a place to defend their reputation. But could you find something that goes into the direction of also attacking them in book epigrams? There are some examples in our corpus of about Lycophron, who is of course a classical author, but I don't have any idea about theological controversies being present in book epigrams.
I mean, the Doxapatris book epigram is actually, it starts with an attack against Ares, but yes, there is nothing about Ares so to speak, in this manuscript. So it's just not really to the point. It's just it's a common feature when you want to praise Athanasius that you remember his fight against Ares. But
right.
I think that then it matters that in a way they would not be looking at not orthodox writings, or not orthodox writings should not be transmitted.
Right. Other remarks, additions, impressions, questions? Okay, then nothing is left but to thank Luise Marion Frenkel again for this very engaging, very inspiring lecture. We all learned again a lot this afternoon. So thank you very much. And I see that people are virtually applauding. I'll also try to applaud for you. I just have to well, perhaps make some promotion for our next lecture, which is going to take place on May 17th. That will be a Tuesday, but the same hour, namely 4 p.m. Lecture by Manolis Patidakis, with the title "Some Aspects of Theodore Prodromos' Poetry in the Tetrastica on Chapters from the Old and New Testaments." So that will be our next lecture in our spring 22 series, speaking from the margins. And then I think I will all wish you a pleasant afternoon, or a pleasant still full day for people joining us from other time zones, and hope to see you again at the next lecture of the DBE series. Thank you very much. Bye bye.